Margaret and I took a trip to Croatia and Slovenia in May and June of 2006. One of the main purposes of the trip was to see some of the ruins from the Roman times that Margaret had read about. Our trip covered every important area of the two countries, except for the northeastern part of Croatia. We drove through Austria and the eastern edge of Slovenia. We stopped for the night in the Croatian town of Varaždin. We stayed at a pension, a short walk from downtown Varaždin. Unfortunately, it was raining most of the time we were there. However, we had brought umbrellas. We spent much of our time walking around the grounds of a white-turreted old fortification. Its construction was begun in the 14th century.
The holes were made for cannon types.
The town center is a marvel of Baroque architecture. Varaždin was once Croatia's capital and most prosperous city. The next day we traveled south from Varaždin to Croatia's current capital, the city of Zagreb. As we drove into the city center, we were overwhelmed by parading students. They were celebrating their graduation day from high school. We walked around the so-called Upper Town. Here is where the city honors its past by preserving old buildings and the intimate streets of the city's old quarter. Margaret purchased a wicker shopping basket at one of the many outdoor markets. We visited the Cathedral of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. This is the majestic central square of Zagreb. It's in the lower town. It's the hub of most of Zagreb's trolley cars. We spent that evening in a town just west of Zagreb called Zama Bor. Zama Bor is a town of about 14,000 people and presents a nice change from the crowds we faced in Zagreb. It has a village atmosphere. There's a shallow stream that flows through the center of town. It's stocked with trout. The houses on either side of the curving stream have interesting architecture. The next day we drove south to one of the most famous tourist attractions in Croatia, the Plitvice Lakes National Park. This park was selected as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in 1979. Its lakes and forests are carefully regulated to ensure their continuing preservation. The park consists of 16 turquoise-colored cascading lakes stretched over 11 miles. That's 18 kilometers. A series of waterfalls and cascading streams connect the lakes. Wooden footbridges and pathways follow the lakes and streams under, around, and across the rumbling water. The extraordinary beauty of the site attracts visitors from all over the world, and there's no bad time, really, to visit the site. In order to help the tourist see more of the area, there are a series of small boats which ferry visitors for a mile or so up the largest lake in the series. The upper lakes boast of luxurious vegetation. The upper lakes are separated by dolomite barriers which expand with the mosses and the algae that absorb calcium carbonate as the river water rushes through the karst. The encrusted plants grow on top of each other, forming travertine barriers and creating waterfalls. This unique interaction of water, rock, and plant life has continued more or less undisturbed since the last ice age. There is plenty of animal life here, but we saw very little of it. Certainly the unspoiled conditions should promote wildlife. We're told there are bear, wolves, deer, rabbits, foxes, and badgers. The colors of the lakes change constantly depending on the quantity of minerals and organisms in the water, and whether rain has deposited mud, and on the angle of the sunlight. We saw azure, bright green, deep blue, and gray. And as you might expect, there are flowers. Some parts of the park, such as here, are covered with beech trees. Other parts of the park have fir spruce or white pine. You do a lot of walking when you visit the park. The Park Service is well organized. For example, in order to ease the walking burden, there is a motorized tram that takes visitors back along the length of the park so they don't have to retrace their steps if they don't want to. We spent almost 2 days in the Plitvice Lakes National Park and then drove toward the coastline. We stopped at the town of Gospic because we had read that it still contained good examples of the destruction which resulted from Croatia's recent war. The damage was obvious. We stopped at a mountain pass and looked out at Croatia's barren Pag Peninsula. It looked as if it wasn't inhabited, but actually it has towns on it. Yet Up on the mountain pass, flowers were in bloom. We hoped that the islands we planned to visit farther south would be more inviting looking than this barren looking Pog Peninsula. So we drove from Gospic over the coastal mountains and then south along the coast to Zadar. Zadar was probably Margaret's favorite town on the whole trip. That's because it gave Margaret a special feeling. There were the marvelous ruins, but it wasn't a especially touristy place. It was a Croatian city occupied by its citizens with some gorgeous ruins. It had marble, it had traffic-free streets, the Roman ruins, of course, the medieval churches, as well as several fascinating museums. This town has been rebuilt several times, but it still retains the look of an ancient Mediterranean city. We were in for a bit of luck in Zadar. Walking back to the car, we saw a crowd gathered outside a small church. They were celebrating a couple's wedding which had just taken place. Later, we looked inside the small church in which the couple had just been married. We had a nice dinner right at our pension just outside of Zadar. The next day, we took a long drive from Zadar south, mostly along the coast and without stopping until we got to the town of Plitvice. We could catch a ferry in Plitvice over to the Pelješac Peninsula. They were really stuffing the cars in like sardines. That's our black car.
I don't see its back, you see.
Ferries are a necessity in getting from one island to another. It took about an hour to reach our destination on the Paleozoic Peninsula. Soon our car was unloaded and we drove down the highway, back toward the mainland. Our final destination for the day was Dubrovnik, located there in the distance. We had taken the ferry from Plitvice over to the Paleozoic Peninsula, and we ended the day at one of Croatia's jewels, the ancient town of Dubrovnik. When one approaches the main entrance to the old fortified town of Dubrovnik, one sees the thick stone wall which surrounds it and has protected it from invaders. This city attracts tourists from all over the world because it is one of the few cities which can claim to represent an ideal larger than itself. Its outer stone walls have protected it from invaders for 700 years. Inside these walls is a vibrant community. Dubrovnik was shelled in 1991, shocking the world. However, the city has bounced back. The blasted streets and the damaged buildings have been mended. The tourist industry, which declined precipitously following the shelling, has bounced back too. During the summer months, cruise ships deposit thousands of passengers at the city gates. In fact, tourism has become so important that the city faces a challenge of how to retain its sense of itself as a living community and avoid becoming an Adriatic theme park. With centuries of experience protecting its commercial and political interests, Dubrovnik has so far managed to welcome the tourists and maintain a unique cultural and spiritual heritage. Dubrovnik offers the visitors a profusion of architectural details on public buildings. It offers a large number of churches, and its narrow pedestrian-only walkways are a delight to explore. The city wall, which goes around the old city, can be explored from the top. Tourists who stay for a few days enjoy the water in the sea just outside the wall.
My hand on
The way in which Dubrovnik's towering walls both define the landscape and blend into the landscape of the sea, sky, and hills enhances the environment here.
Or you could exit here.
I think it does start up there.
We stayed at a hotel about 4 blocks from the water and about a 20-minute bus ride from the old town. The activity in the evening was just as active as it was in the daytime. We decided to save ourselves from driving back the way we came down. We decided to see if we could get tickets in Dubrovnik to ferry the car north up to Split, our next destination. This is the name of the ferry company that services most of the Croatian coastline.
Persons and a car.
We were lucky and we got tickets.
I need these, your first and last lane boats.
There were the usual last-minute arrivals as our ferry departed. As we left Dubrovnik, we could see landmarks we'd first seen driving into town 3 days before. The trip took all day on the ferry. The ferry made stops at 2 islands. The first was Korčula. Its town had some beautiful old fortifications. It was fun to watch the tourists boarding and to see the types of different vehicles they had brought out to the island. Our second intermediate stop was Stari Grad. A lot of tourists were getting off here. The ferry docked at our destination, Split, around 6 o'clock in the evening. We followed our guidebook's recommendation and drove south of town to look for a suitable pension for a 3-night stay. We settled on Pension Amigos. It had a nice parking area, and it was located right on the waterfront. The manager also was the head cook and spoke German. He served us some memorable meals in our stay at Split. Parking in Split was a real problem, so we took the city bus into Split's old town. Split is the second largest city in Croatia. Split is one of the most fascinating cities in Europe. The old town has Diocletian's Palace, a UNESCO heritage site. People have built their homes right up against and using the old palace walls as part of their house structure. Split is in the heart of the Dalmatian coast and is an excellent jumping-off point for day excursions. During our stay in Split, we drove the short distance to Trogir. Trogir has a population of only 2,000 people. It is a walled town on a small island with a wide waterfront promenade that encloses a maze of medieval streets. No other town in Dalmatia better shows the cultural life that once flourished along this coast in spite of a series of foreign rulers. This is the Venetian Cathedral of St. Lavro. It was built from the 13th to the 15th centuries. It is one of the finest architectural works in Croatia. Tombstones. At lunchtime, we visited the local outdoor market. When we left Trogir, we made a long day's drive north to a town of special interest, Pula. We considered ourselves lucky to get a room at the Scarletta Hotel because it was located only a half a block from the magnificent Roman amphitheater in Pula. This amphitheater was built in the 1st century. It was built entirely from local limestone. The amphitheater was designed to host gladiator contests and could accommodate up to 20,000 spectators. Many of the stone spectator seats were removed in the Middle Ages and used for building material elsewhere. On top of the 100-foot high walls is a gutter that collected rainwater. The outer wall, which is still almost completely intact, contains 2 rows of 72 arches. I went wild taking pictures. There are many other wonderful Roman ruins in Pula. This is the Triumphal Arch of Sergius, built in 27 before Christ. Incredible. Pula hosts many concerts and other forms of entertainment during the summer months. A mock Roman gladiator contest was scheduled for one of our evenings there. The gladiator actors promoted the event by parading through the streets. After looking at the gladiators, we decided we'd miss the grand event in the evening. For lunch, we went to the local open-air market to get our fresh produce. From the wonderful town of Pula, we drove north to the town of Poreč. Poreč is a seacoast town of about 20,000 people. The town is devoted to tourism. The compact old town is squeezed into a peninsula and packed with thousands of shops. The main reason to visit Poreč is to see the 6th century Euphrasia Basilica. This World Heritage Site is one of the finest intact examples of Byzantine art. The complex includes a church, atrium, and baptistry. Mosaics from earlier structures are still visible in some places, but it is the glittering wall mosaics in the apse that really attract the crowds. Margaret had tasted some wine she really liked 2 nights before in Pula. It was a local wine, and she asked where the vineyard was located. Well, it was near Poreč, so we set out to look for it, asking a number of different people where to find this particular vineyard. It seemed very confusing, and each person had his own favorite vineyard to recommend instead.
Where come from?
We came from here.
Well, we tried to find it, but eventually gave up and turned in at the next vineyard that advertised wine for sale. The lady said she sold that kind of wine, so Margaret went in to taste it.
Das ist Malvasia. Glas plus Wein. 10 Kuna eine Flasche. Ja, eine Flasche. Ja. 10 Kuna, 1 bottle.
In the end, she bought a half-dozen bottles of different blends and kinds of wine. While we were in the vicinity of Pula, we decided to visit another interesting town nearby, Rovinj. Rovinj is one of the last of the true Mediterranean fishing ports. Its sailing boats captured Margaret's attention. It's a beautiful sight. There's an old town, there's a cathedral, and there are lots of tourists. From Rovinj, we drove north across the border and into Slovenia, and stayed overnight in a town near Piran. Picturesque Piran is everyone's favorite town on the Slovenian coast. It sits on the tip of a narrow peninsula. This is a popular tourist destination for Italians. We were told the town can be a mob scene in the summer months. While we were visiting Piran, the town was relatively quiet. Piran's old town is a gem of Venetian Gothic architecture and is full of narrow streets. We left Piran driving farther north into the so-called Slovenian Alps, a mountainous area providing excellent hiking in the summer and good skiing in the winter. This mountainous area of Slovenia is well known for its outdoor activities. This river was fast running from the spring snowmelt, and the kayak enthusiasts were taking full advantage of it. The spring weather also brings out the wildflowers. We saw them most places we visited in Slovenia. We drove through Tribler National Park, which contains many of Slovenia's mountains. Many of the peaks in this region rise to over 6,000 feet, that's 2,000 meters, above sea level. Many good hiking trails begin from this highway. The highway we took over the mountains has a large number of switchbacks. We drove carefully because you could never guess what might be hidden around the next tight turn. Each curve was numbered. One popular resort area is Bled, a tourist community centered around a lake below an old castle. For dinner, we sought out a restaurant that specialized in good local cuisine, according to our guidebook. A short drive east from this mountainous recreation area is Slovenia's capital, Ljubljana. Ljubljana has almost 300,000 inhabitants. The Ljubljanica River runs right through the center of town. One prominent landmark is the Cathedral. There is a castle at the top of a hill in the central part of town. We climbed the hill to the castle. The path was quite steep. From the castle proper, one could easily see the mountains to the north and the rooftops below. I thought the squarish-looking building on the left looked atrocious. We wanted an even better view, so we climbed up the stairs inside the castle to its very topmost point. There was a grand view.
Which way are you meant to go down?
Because why? Because it's all irregular.
Mm-hmm. But the streets below lured us back down, where lots of people use bicycles as their means of transportation. The city's center is a pedestrian-only zone. Of course, bicycles are allowed. Unfortunately, the art of graffiti has found its way to Ljubljana. We found many styles of architecture in the old town. Many of the structures are Baroque. Some of the older houses have retained a medieval layout. This building is more Renaissance. One striking bridge over the Ljubljana River is the Dragon Bridge. I was told that the town people say the bronze dragons wag their tails whenever a virgin crosses the bridge. Well, I was watching the dragons closely for 15 minutes, and I never saw their tails move. Another set of interesting bridges is the Triple Bridge. Here, there's a pedestrian bridge on each side of a vehicular bridge. Many imposing buildings face the Triple Bridge. We spent 2 days in Ljubljana. When we left Ljubljana, we drove a very short distance to Sticina. Here is Slovenia's oldest monastery and one of the country's most important religious and cultural monuments. The monastery was established in the 12th century. Today it is in use. There are 7 priests and 6 monks in residence. The room where the priests dined was interesting.
So they walk, going down, and with the cross in their hands.
We joined another small group of interested tourists and had a young lady guide who showed us around.
You know Latin?
Few words.
Confere, the word that comes colatio, means carry.
The Abbey Church was very nice. From Sticina, we drove to one of the western borders of Slovenia to visit the castle at Retta. Slovenia is blessed with several fine castles. The castle at Retta is located in an agricultural area and is the only castle we visited. It is perched on a hill above the village of Retta. It still looks today about the way it did when it was built in 1200 AD. Unfortunately, our French-speaking guide would not allow any sort of photography after we got inside.
Place, it's
Not allowed to have
No
photographs and no video. But the medieval kitchen was so interesting that I did sneak a little bit of video there. After leaving the castle at Retta, we drove north to the town of Patooie. Patooie is one of the oldest towns in Slovenia, and it rivals Ljubljana in terms of its historical importance. Patooie began life as a Roman outpost. Although there is a lot to see here, we concentrated on the Dominican monastery. It contains a regional museum with an archaeological collection. There were some carvings related to the god Mithras. Margaret's guidebook talked about a recent archaeological finding of a small temple located just outside of Patooie. There was a neighbor lady, whom we found tending her vegetable garden, who was responsible for opening this temple for visitors.
It is a mystical religion, and so it was.
The place felt very old and very real.
Yes, of course we can walk down there.
This temple was devoted to the god Mithras. After our visit to the temple, we climbed back into our rented Renault car and drove back to Speyer. It had been a marvelous trip through Croatia and Slovenia.